Hey everybody, welcome to CGMA. I am Aaron Lamonic, I'm your instructor, and the course is entitled Environment Design 1. We're going to start this off I'm going to basically give you a brief introduction of myself and show you some of my work and some of the context for some of the things I've done just so you can get familiar with my sort of background and what the expectations are of, the things that I'm going to be covering. I'm also going to go into a brief outline of basically how the course is going to be broken down. There are a lot of things that are going to be covered. It's going to be a lot of information, but I don't want to make anyone feel intimidated or overwhelmed by this because it's really, regardless of skill level, we're going to be focusing on the same thing. It's going to be back to the basics, the foundation skills of design, and that's environment design. That's what we're doing. So yes, I will be teaching lots of techniques and a lot of how to, but I also encourage everyone to ask why. Why some of these choices are made, and I'm going to be explaining. Even if you don't ask, I'm going to be explaining a lot of why, because to me, I think that's honestly the more important thing. Everyone will learn technique within due time, and it's just something that comes with experience and a little bit of research on your own. But the design side is something that I think is a lot more valuable, and something that is lacking in a lot of art is a lack of attention to design. Maybe it's just lack of interest or just overly focus on on technique, but we're going to focus a lot on that in this class. And so, style wise, I don't want anyone to think there's an expectation of a particular style or that I want people to copy my style. Or you'll see by looking at my work that I don't really have a style. I work a lot of different ways and I have a lot of different interests. So I would encourage you to use this time wisely to really explore style, what that means to you, and really explore different possibilities for how you can work, because that's the number one benefit you get as a student, that you never quite get that as a professional. You don't have all that leisure. So we're going to go through a little bit of my work, take a look at that really quick. So this is a piece done largely in 3D, mostly in 3D, which again is not a prerequisite or something required for this class, but just wanted to show you a broad spectrum of things that I've done. So largely 3D here, a little bit of painting on top and textures obviously in 2D, but a lot of 3D work, and I did all the design work in a quick 2D painting, all the figuring out of the big things, and then when I get down into the specifics, that's when I get into the 3D and the modeling and the layout, and really figuring out the dimensions and the scale and everything that's a little bit more difficult to do in 2D. That's when I use 3D for that, and to get the accuracy of the lighting and really get the colors right. I can play with a lot of different atmospheric conditions to get that look that I was going for. So that's kind of the way I do this. Yeah, so I'll show you a variety of stuff. You'll see a lot of different ways that I've worked. So this piece, another sci-fi piece, I'd like to just call to attention that that 60-40 rule that I like to look at, which is that if 60% of a piece is things that we're familiar with, and 40% is change to become slightly alien, it's definitely a good ratio to start with if you want kind of a realistic sci-fi look. If it gets too abstract, sometimes we don't have a relatability. We don't have any human touchstones to relate to. So I really like to incorporate that and try and do things that are recognizable from our world, but then change the context and how those shapes are used, so that understanding the shape language is very important in how you design things, and what you're telling us the shapes mean. But you can play with things enough to where they feel alien, but we still recognize that shape language that we're used to seeing. So you'll see that a lot in my work. Another sci-fi piece, largely 3D, but again, attention to design. You notice that some of the main there's a sense of consistency. Really, when you're designing stuff that's otherworldly or stuff that is not meant to feel like this, modern time and on Earth, it's important to create some sort of foundation or base for everything to be unified with. So in this case, I'm using a lot of language from space station kind of shape language and aircraft carrier language, these kind of industrial shapes that we're used to seeing. But then I'm using it on a massive scale, and then I modeled smaller ships to be duplicated in a giant, armada of ships flying underneath this huge space station or command center. And I have a lot of fun with the sci-fi design influenced by the 70s and 80s original sci-fi artists, and of course grew up on Star Wars like anyone else growing up in the 80s. And it's influenced me tremendously, and I've learned so much about design from my, the things I was interested in as a child, which I value very highly because it teaches you, really design is the one thing that no matter what happens to the technology and what happens to the skill set that you have in terms of technical skill, um, your sense of design is always going to be your best friend, and it'll always keep you relevant no matter what. You'll always need to learn new tools. Yes, 3D tools will get better and rendering tools will get better, and guess what? You'll learn those, but your sense of design, which means the choices you make, your intentions, the choices you make will always be there, and they will always, that's what people will really hold on to is the choices that you make in this kind of stuff. So just a quick shift here, going into something that is totally not realistic and totally stylized. The main reason I'm showing this is because although it's not purely an environment, there is a bit of environment to it because there's so many layers and so much density to it. But when you have something here which is, largely realistic and modeled and very accurate, the scale and everything is all measured out in 3 dimension. This is 100% painted. I worked on it with a couple other artists because it was too much to handle in the deadline that we had. So I divvied it up and we all kind of worked on our own sections. But it's stylized comic booky take on the 80s Transformers, the original ones, but made into a more modern kind of look, something that we relate to a little bit more now, a little bit more tech looking. So that's kind of what it was, but just the idea showing that I work a lot of different ways and I'm interested in style. I'm so interested in different styles. So I would encourage people to definitely pursue that. Here we have something that is very important to me, which is visual development. Showing a lot about exploring tons of ideas, not just one or two, the first ideas that come into your head, but exploring as many as you can possibly get out. And you will see that when you think that you've ran out of ideas, you keep going, you'll end up with more and better ones, and they'll become more refined. So that's another thing we're going to focus on quite a bit. Again, here going into a more stylized vision, a much more stylized vision, on a scale of 1 to 10, try and decide how realistic you are from a 1, from a very graphic, very stylized image, to a 10, a matte painting, photoreal image. Try and decide what you're going for. How realistic are you going to go with it? How realistic are the colors, and how realistic is your value range, and how realistic is your shape language? Maybe your color and value are very naturalistic and your shape language is more stylized, like something like this. These are things to consider. Again, I really hold value very highly. Sometimes I'll work just directly in value, and it has a very interesting feel to it. When you just focus on value, you don't worry about color. It leaves a lot open to the imagination, so I really enjoy doing that as well. And I think value is a lot more important than color as well, so we will be focusing on that. Last few of my pieces here are pieces from The Last of Us, which is a project I worked on recently at Naughty Dog. And we, developed a post-apocalyptic world that wasn't necessarily depressing and just a downer all the time, but had a reclamation of the world by nature, which was beautiful instead of depressing. So showing the nature overclaiming the world in almost a kind of a it's a beautiful decay, so to speak. I know it's a cliche phrase, but that's kind of what we were going for in terms of what the impact should be of how things are overgrown. Another piece from The Last of Us here, just a more of a piece on lighting and just a very very emotional storm. The last bits of light coming through the sky, but really trying to focus on the mood in this piece more than anything else. Again, here a snowy forest, which is, you could say you've seen 1,000 snowy forests, but there's also 1,000 different ways to do a snowy forest. So really focusing on our art direction and our particular brand of this environment. Really trying to figure out what are our statements going to be. What are we trying to say with our snowy forest, and what our needs are in terms of our functionality of it. So just to give you just a teeny bit of what my work sort of looks like. There's hundreds more, but we'll get into more of that as we go. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the expectations for the course. The way that the course is laid out basically is that we will progress week by week, starting out with a lesson and following with an assignment that is to echo that lesson. And as the weeks go on, we're going to start out with more of the beginning stages of the process, a little bit more of the design side, the thinking, how to set up a piece, how to design your composition, how to really think about composing and arranging your information so that it's going to be the most accessible to the viewer. And as a concept artist, that is your number one goal, is to really make your ideas clean. So we're going to be focusing on that in the beginning, and as we go, we're going to introduce more complex ideas. We're not going to use color until week 4, and we're going to progress through the weeks and learn more about finishing and rendering. So this way, it's a nice transition and a nice build up from what is the basic stuff, which is the foundation, which is to me essential. So we're going to go over that and then move on from there. Week 4, you will get your final assignment laid out for you, and we'll have the second half of the term to work on that final assignment. It's very important to me that you guys walk away with something from this class, and that you have a nice portfolio piece to show. So we're going to really polish that up, hopefully learning all of the beginning stages and the development process, which I'm going to teach in the first half. When we go into the finishing stuff, it'll be just technique at that point, and I will constantly reiterate the things about design and the thinking that I want you guys to be able to have and to command. And as we do that, we will also refine our finishing skills. So yeah, that's basically it. There'll be Q&A every week, so there'll be plenty of time for you guys to ask questions and get feedback on your work, which I'll be doing paint overs every week as well on your assignments. So that's basically the intro to the class. Well, I'm going to jump right into a demo here and do a little bit of lecturing and demo at the same time, and break down our first assignment and our first sort of subject matter that we're going to be covering. So again, I'm very excited to start this off, and thank you guys for joining in. Let's get started right away. So I just wanted to introduce the basic elements of the demo here. These are just 3 sort of categories that I'm going to start with before we go into doing the actual demo. And these are just things to generally keep in mind that are going to get you on the right track. Now, I mean, a lot of this stuff is fairly basic, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard this before. But for the people that didn't, for the people that sort of just need a little bit of a Kickstarter, a little bit of something to refresh their memory, hopefully this will do it. And these aren't the only ways of thinking. These aren't the only categories. These are just a few main things that are going to help. They're going to help with this sort of quick study process that we're going to be going forward with. It's going to all make sense. So you're gonna have a picture plane. Picture plane meaning there's your bounding box or image. This is our little digital chalkboard, by the way. Generally, you have your image broken down into thirds, roughly. So ideally, you want to keep your focal point or something that is of interest generally in one of the third sort of areas, somewhere in this region. The main reason why you don't want to have something dead center is because it doesn't create much movement, or it doesn't create much interest to the composition, and it feels a little bit unnatural. Now, the fact that we are looking through a square into an image is actually very unnatural for your brain. Your brain wants to see things in 3 dimensions the way we see the world. So looking at an image, as you're actually tricking your brain to believe this, to believe that we're looking through, to forget about the fact that you're looking through a window into this world, and you want us to look at it and you want us to be drawn into it and see it as a real thing. So that is why by keeping things asymmetrical, by keeping some form of an interesting object out of the center and in an ideal third proportion, on the thirds, you are throwing us off that you've put an image in a side of a box. Now, having something in the center is doable, but if you're doing that, you better have a good reason for doing that. So it should feel like it's supposed to be a symmetrical composition. It should feel that it's supposed to be some kind of a long hallway looking at a huge throne, or a huge something that makes sense why it would be dead center. So again, rules are made to be broken, but you wouldn't be breaking the rules if you have a good reason for why you're doing it. So generally speaking, again, you don't want to just literally start every piece by putting the same size object right in the perfect third. Just generally that it feels like your focal point or your object is falling somewhere in the third range, just not dead center and not squeezed over all the way to the edge, because again, that'll make us feel a tension that is not wanted, and it will draw our attention to the fact that, oh, there's this box that we're looking through at this image, and it's weird that this thing's all the way to the side. What's all this empty space over on the left? You want to trick us that we're looking at an image inside of a box. So that's really a large part of that. Now, another part of the composition that we want to focus on is the movement side of it. So generally speaking, we want to create movement within that. So how do we do that? Well, there's a lot of different ways. There are circular kind of movement inside compositions. There are S-curve movement inside compositions. There are straight movement inside compositions. But what are all those things? All those things are our path of vision. How are we steering the eye through this composition? Do we have our main focal point is off here in the distance, maybe 30, 40 meters away. We have a winding road going to that, and then we have a foreground object setting the space that we are standing near the foreground, looking into something in the distance, and then some kind of other element giving us the sense of depth and space that is off in the distance to bring our eye into the composition, bring us through it, and then back around again. So this is a kind of movement. We want to focus on some kind of a path of vision. We want to move our eye through the composition. Now there's other kinds of paths of vision. Like I said, there are just linear paths of vision. Start off with some kind of a foreground element. Not every image has to have a foreground element, by the way. I'm just doing this to sort of give you a general idea, but you could have that, maybe some kind of like boulders in the shot, a couple interesting overlaps, and our focal point be off in the distance. Now, I would say that we're not making the best use of the path of vision because it's very linear and we're not making use of this whole area here. So you somehow want to integrate the rest of that space. I would say maybe you put the focal point here. Now again, this is in a nice part of the composition. And then you have other objects that move us through the composition, other objects that help us arrive there, supporting objects. So not focal points. Our focal point is our focal point, but you could call them secondary focal points. Some people do that, but really what it is just that you have other objects that are supporting it, but there's something reserved for your focal point. There's something special about that shape that we don't see anywhere else. And that shape is what your eye is ultimately going to be drawn to. But the way we use the space is meant to bring us in and bring us back around, keep us within that composition. The main elements to be aware of are placement, keeping your focal point generally in the third of the composition, dividing line, but not so obviously, but just generally speaking, it should feel like it's somewhere in the thirds, not uncomfortably placed right down the center. If you have an object placed right in the center, unless it's very intentional that that's what we were trying to do, is create a symmetrical, regal, royal type of composition, then it's just going to make the viewer feel like something is wrong or uncomfortable, and they won't be able to exactly explain why sometimes. So creating an interesting positive shape and an interesting negative shape, dividing up the space in an asymmetrical way is a good way to start. So leading right into avoiding that uncomfortable symmetry. So a large object squished right in the center of a composition with the same size negative shapes on either side, it's just going to create a kind of tension that isn't usually what we want to do in these images. Again, we want to make the viewer forget about a 2D picture plane and get absorbed into the image, get drawn in. Same thing here. We don't want to block the viewer off, or we don't want to box the composition off. This makes us aware of the fact that we're looking at a composition. We want to create movement and a path of vision within that space. You want our eye to move into the composition, stay in it, and then move back through it again. So again, we're not taking the viewer on some kind of a strange roller coaster ride. It's nothing like that, but subconsciously they will be pulled into the image in a comfortable way that will make them feel like it's a naturalistic image. And that's really the main thing we want to do, is maintain that sense of illusion. Perspective is another thing altogether. Perspective, you have basically just a real quick idea, 3 different types of perspective. One is a 1 point, and in a 1 point, your vanishing point, which there's your horizon line, all perspective goes to the one vanishing point. Now, this can be very interesting. It's sometimes not the most interesting, but it can be interesting. If you have forms sitting in space, all those forms are going to be converging at this one vanishing point. Now, it could be very easily become maybe a little bit boring, but it's not usually a problem. It's only a problem if, again, you create some form of symmetry and we become painfully aware that we are drawn to the 1 point perspective, and that is, again, we're looking through a square at an artificial image. That's the only reason why that's the only reason why these rules exist, is to avoid things being symmetrical or somehow slightly boring. So, or not boring, but necessarily, but contrived. So another way is the 2 point. 2-point perspective. Usually one point will be, so here's our horizon line. Usually one point will be inside of the picture plane and one point will be outside of the picture plane. The reason why is because you'll have less distortion if you do this. I'm just doing this very loosely as if we're just quickly sketching it on a chalkboard, but and all this is going to do, and see, you can already see there's a fair amount of distortion happening, but this is going to give us a little bit more dynamic sense of perspective. It's a little bit more dynamic. Now this is, one point is very aggressive. You know, one point is very, there's a lot of motion. It's like a radial explosion all the way towards that center point. Now again, notice where I place that. That's in a place where we'll have some interesting, larger, less distorted stuff over here, and we'll have some very distorted, very pinched stuff over here. So it's in a place where it allows for some interesting asymmetry. Same thing here. You put one vanishing point here, you'll have things very drastically diminishing to that vanishing point here, and then over here you'll have a little bit less distortion. But again, be very careful as to where you put things, because sometimes when they fall within a certain area, those points will be really distorted and our eye doesn't see that way. Again, the rules are made to be broken, but the rules are there for a reason. The rules are to prevent you from accidentally doing something unnatural. If you know what you're doing, it's very easy to draw out of your head and to come and make things up, and you will not do anything unnatural because you have a good feel for it. But this is hard to do in the beginning. So there you go, 2-point. And then, last but most definitely not least, 3-point. The most complex, but very useful, in which case we have once again, one vanishing point outside, one somewhere inside, and one vertical vanishing point. Now, if these vanishing points are too close together, you're going to get some really crazy results, and they're not going to be crazy in a good way. So, comes a bit of experience. Experience will go a long way. A little bit of trial and error and you won't make too many mistakes. But you can see what I've already done, there's going to be some major distortion happening here. As I draw a form in space, there's definitely going to be a fair amount of distortion. And if I go somewhere over here, the closer you are to a vanishing point, generally the more things get distorted. But it's a general way to start thinking about how to place objects in space. When you get into trouble and you don't know exactly what you're doing, again, you don't literally start every composition by plotting out every rectangle in perfect 3-point perspective or 2-point or 1-point perspective, but if you need to, this is a good way to start envisioning how objects sit in space. And when you get used to it, you can just sketch this way automatically without having to think about where every single vanishing point is, and you'll just be able to do it.